Okay then. Good morning, everybody. I am going to, for those of you on the phone, we have a number of people here in the room, but I know we've got a number of people on the phone. We may be waiting for one or two other people that could, it looks like, may still be coming up. And I don't think we have a quorum in the room yet, but we can go ahead and begin with introductions and the roll call, and then we'll hold off on doing any votes until we have our full quorum here. So, Joan, will you go ahead and call the roll?
Absolutely. Ms. Belova? Ms. Butler-Painter?
Here.
Mr. Cardwell? Mr. Dalton?
Here.
Ms. Dorsch?
Here.
Mr. Fizzette?
Here.
Mr. Hall? Mr. Maestri? Mr. Mormon?
Here.
Miss Moses Ned?
Here.
Mr. Nichols? Mr. Sadid? Mr. Spoor?
Here.
Ms. Zimmerman?
Here.
Okay. So I think, and is Travis still outside? People are, so it sounds like we're still waiting on a few more people who will be joining us here in the room today, and then a few more people as well by phone. But I think I'd like to go ahead and get started just with a couple of introductory items. Well, first, I know we have public comment on the agenda. Haley, is there anybody on the line for public comment? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. Haley, hopefully you heard that. Thank you. You heard my question?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Anybody on the line who would like to share public comment at this time, please raise your hand in the participant column and we will call on you. All right, I'm not seeing any at this time.
Okay, great. Well, I just have a couple announcements that I'd like to share with you all as we're getting started here. But back in January, on I think it was the 13th of January, the CTB did approve a revised FY22 to FY27 6-year plan, and that included new revenues that were announced that were part of the governor's budget that was released in mid-December. And because of the increase in those revenues, hi Sharon. So yeah, so I see Vice Chair Bulova just joined us here. So for those of you on the phone, so there was an additional 2.6 billion in statewide transportation revenues that were added to our 6-year plan for FY22 to FY7, and that was as a result of some revenue increases to the Transportation Trust Fund. So a significant amount of new money. That also then filtered down into an additional $215 million for Vpra between the years of FY22 to FY7, and that 27, and also another $2.7 million in freight projects for here at DRPT. So that additional $215 million is very good news for Vpra. Again, that was over and above what we were forecasting earlier. And I know Steve had talked about some of that, and we'll talk about the budget some more when we get to the FY23 budget. After our last Vpra January meeting, where you all authorized the executive director to sign the Norfolk Southern agreements, DJ did execute those, and that was announced on, I believe it was January 14th, publicly by the governor. So I'm sorry, January 13th. So again, that was a very exciting announcement for us as well. We have a lot on the agenda today. With our executive director report, we'll be talking about the FY23 budget and referring that to CTB. We'll have updates on our Transforming Rail in Virginia projects, a bit about two other projects that you haven't heard before, St. Julian's Gardens, the property acquisition, and Arkandale to Powell's Creek, third track project, as well as an update from Jeremy Latimer on safety and we will be going into a closed session. Two more announcements real quick. At our Finance Committee meeting last month, for those of you that weren't able to attend that, we discussed our potential changes to our investment policy that would take into account some additional climate change factors and environmental ESG, some equity, social justice factors as well. And we did receive a presentation from our financial advisors related to a index that we could adopt that would be part of our investment policy. That is something that we'll be bringing back to you at our next meeting. But I did want to flag that for those of you that weren't able to be at our Finance Committee in January. We did receive a presentation from the investment advisor on that. And then last but not least, I regret to announce that Hussein Saeed will be stepping down from the board. He is actually retiring in full from his professional life or his professional job at VMFA. And as a result, will be stepping down from a number of his boards and commissions that he serves on as well. And so that will be effective next month. So we'll be working with the governor's office on a new potential appointee representing the Richmond area jurisdictions. So, with that sums up my my announcements. Does anyone have any questions for me before we move on? No? Okay. So since we are still, I'm going to ask DJ to go on to the executive director report as an informational item because we're still waiting on one or two more people, I think. And DJ?
Okay, great. Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's good to see folks that are here in the room. Apologies for the space. We have been blessed with our partners at VDOT allowing us to use their spacious auditorium, and it gives us a much better opportunity to social distance. Unfortunately, they had a conflict today because we had to change the date because of the governor's revenues that were released. And so we're now doing it in DRPT space, which also very generous to allow us, but not quite as spacious. So as I go through the executive director's report, we have a group of staff in the conference room next door that have been given full rights to chime in and offer commentary as they see fit. I just want to go briefly through an update of where we are in Vpra. If you could move forward to the executive director's report. Two more slides. Excellent. All right, administrative updates. We, as Chair reported, finalized the agreement with Norfolk Southern. That was a great deal of work that many folks have done by the end of the year. So knock on wood, that was complete. And we high-fived and had a great celebration that afternoon, and then the next morning the real work started. We're now under, I don't want to say significant pressure, but I think significant pressure works to get to financial close by the middle of the year. This is the deal that allows us to run to the Western Rail Initiative areas, to the New River Valley, and we will get the new Lynchburg-Roanoke train in place as soon as we get to financial close, so the pressure is pretty high. We do need to make sure, though, that we're not moving too quickly on this. There's a lot of environmental due diligence that comes with acquiring a 28-mile rail line, and as we go through not only the diligence on the line, but looking for the feasibility of the new station sites in Christiansburg, there's a great deal of work to be done between now and summer. But it's exciting, and it's really the next phase of what we're looking to do. That additional frequency to Roanoke and Lynchburg will increase ridership, we project, very significantly. On the downside of this update, Amtrak has informed us about 2 weeks ago that they are temporarily canceling some service, not all service, some service across the country. And one of our Virginia trains is impacted by that. We have the Newport News train, which will be canceled until the end of March. It's unfortunate because we've already received calls from folks in the public like, hey, I've been looking for this train and I can't take it, what's going on? Amtrak has been struggling with staffing challenges because of COVID and other reasons. It's very difficult, as anybody touching the labor market knows. We're working with them to get the train reinstated as soon as possible. Right now it's canceled through the end of March. If you go to the next slide, please, it's just an update on what we're doing to attract folks to the train, a couple sales that are coming on. Sales are ongoing starting next week. Well, here February 9th, so starting late next week, and travel through the end of summer, no blackouts. So we think that will help us boost ridership. Next slide talks a little bit about staffing. We are currently at 16 full-time employees, and we have 5 additional offers that have been accepted. With the 13 job openings, that will get us to our end-of-year projection of 34. We'll talk a little bit later about a couple of the key openings that we've struggled with. You see the list of the folks that have joined in January. We would introduce them. In fact, John's in the other room. And then we have a couple other folks to include administrative assistant, executive assistant. Mary Estelle Douglas comes on February 10th, which will be a great relief to everybody who, yesterday we were in here at 6:30 in the morning copying things. So that will help keep us organized for sure. 3 other positions have been accepted to include our Director of Government Affairs and Communication, which will help us to continue to grow our social media. You may have seen we are more active on Twitter and on LinkedIn, and that will continue to grow as that person who reports up to Joan Panic arrives March 10th, I believe. If you go to the next slide, we look at the ridership for our Virginia trains. This is specifically looking month by month. We saw a dip in December from about 4,000 riders. This, we believe, is due to the uptick in the virus. Also, the Thanksgiving, we really had great ridership over Thanksgiving, which made November higher than we expected. If you just look October to November to December, November was a big bump over October, and December is still higher than October was on the reduction. What's interesting to me there is that if you look at the decline from November to December, we actually were pretty strong on the Norfolk route and the Richmond route, which is a good sign for ridership. Newport News, with that little dip, that dip's going to get even worse with the cancellation of the 1 train through March. So it's something that we'll look at closely when the train comes back. We'll have to do some kind of sale or event to get that ridership back. But all in all, not a bad story. We're watching it closely again as we go through the new variants each and every day, it seems. The next slide shows you the comparison year over year. Once again, you can see the dip in December 2021. Even with that dip, though, it's significantly higher than December 2020, about just over 172%. So somewhere between 2 and 3 times the ridership that we had in December 2020. Good sign for recovery. And again, we feel confident that as we go into the new calendar year, we're going to see continued growth in ridership. Next slide shows the federal fiscal year to date ridership. Same story, just gives you a different cut of the numbers. We again feel comfortable with the progression going forward. We're at about 80% of the ridership from 2 years ago, from 2019, which was our record year, and then fiscal year 2020. This shows numbers through December. It was February or March of the following of fiscal year 2020 when the numbers really dipped down. So right now, we're at 72% of where we were fiscal year to date 2020. That number is going to grow because the 2020 number is going to go down significantly over the next few months. But continued signs that recovery is going well. Next slide is not a great news slide. Next slide is on-time performance. Our October and November on-time performance has dipped significantly, and I know I'm sitting for a Rich in the spotlight for a moment. Really, I think has struggled as well, just as the corridor between BC and Fredericksburg specifically has been really crowded for October, November. A couple weather events and lots of rain that slowed folks down. We talked to Amtrak about this, and we're working on a plan to bring that back, but those numbers, 68.8% in November, and it's just unacceptable. You compare that to the 97% a year earlier. Obviously, a year earlier there was less traffic, but still that's something that we can't allow to continue, and we're working to turn that around. That ends the administrative portion. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or else I'm going to go to capital projects.
Question?
Yes.
What were some of the causes for the on-time performance?
So the 3 biggest were commuter train interference, which isn't really fair because we are slowed down because the VRE train is in front of us. That's commuter train interference. Unfortunately, VRE is slowed down because there's a freight train in front of them, and and they get the blame.
Oh, big happy family.
That is, and changes. We should call it other train interference because the second highest reason for delay was freight train interference, and then the third one was slower due to weather delays. So those are the three.
Yeah, there were some other anomalies going on at that time too. We had some unusual, unusual, police activity and stuff at some stations that unfortunately are right in the peak of the peak, particularly on the southbound PM trains. But you're going to see December and January's reliability numbers have gone back up, even with the, various weather events and stuff like that we've had. So at least in the network, so it should be reflected.
Strongly agree, and I don't want to jinx this, but when I look at that, those are things that are out of our control. I mean, the police activity, incredibly unfortunate, you can't control it. The good news is that when you look at those top reasons for delay, none of them were mechanical. And those are the things that we really get on top of Amtrak for, because those are preventable. And we've not seen, knock on wood, mechanical issues be part of these delays, which is a big positive.
That's just a quick follow-up, because, when you're in Europe, it seems like the train is always exactly on time every time I've ridden the train there. So, I look at ours and, granted this was an anomaly this month, but even when we're back to our normal, we're not at 100 or 98. We're, in the high 80s or low 90s. Are there some systemic, aside from having your own track, right? Are there some systemic solutions in terms of the freight trains that you're also trying to work on during this period before we get to where we want to get in 5 or 10 years?
So you really have the easy answer. The easy answer is that if you go to the European trains, they don't have that mixed use right of way, and they don't have the freight problems. Another issue with our delays is when there are trespassers, for example. We often, as a country, take a long time releasing the train, and that's something that we and Amtrak and localities have worked on. If it's a crime scene, obviously, and I'm not a law enforcement official, so I'm not going to pass any judgment, but there are times when they spend a lot more time than others, and freight railroads historically are not really moved by that. They say, hey, take as much time as you leave, our coal's going to wait, but unfortunately, our passengers deserve better than that, and so we do work with the local law enforcement agencies to move those things along when they happen.
That's a really good point.
I'm going to ask if everyone can speak a little higher.
Certainly, my apologies. Any other questions? Okay, capital projects, next slide. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because the next agenda item is actually Mike giving TRV initiative updates, Transforming Rail in Virginia. He's going to give much more detail about these capital projects. I'll just touch on the good news issues and then leave the rest to Mike. Longbridge, another room. Longbridge, we received 15% design, and we are reviewing that. That is obviously the big project for our capacity, and we're happy to report that stays on schedule. We've got a good partnership with FTA and with the DC government folks, and that's really moving smartly. Franconia is also on that page. We are so close to signing a contract for preliminary engineering on that. We had weeks of negotiations with potential vendors, and we feel now that we are in a good place. So we hope to sometime over the next few weeks get that through the approval processes and get that signed so we can begin moving on that. That's, again, one of the key projects we're working on. Next slide is pretty straightforward, not a whole lot of movement on those. We're working with the project authorization with Csx. And then if you look at the next slide, when there's the New River Valley Station Service Facility. We started a public outreach, public survey that ended, actually I guess it ended yesterday. So we're gathering that data. We're going to have a public meeting with folks in New River Valley, one in February and then in March, to go through the different station options there and get a sense for the feasibility and cost of each. And by feasibility, that's not only what's best for the community as far as a moving people point of view, but what the environmental issues are, what construction costs would be. There are a couple of sites that have significant grading issues, so we'll have that information over the next month or two, which will allow us to move forward on those.
Can I ask on that?
Yeah, sure.
Are you working with, the New River Valley, like, regional council or any of the other local partners there that just kind of help make sure you're reaching
Yes.
as much public as possible?
Yeah, in fact, a couple of months ago, I went down and presented to the New River Valley Authority, very closely with them. Ray Smoot, who's a member of the CTV, has been integral in just making sure we make the right connections down there. What we want is when we come up with the final station sites, we don't want anybody to be surprised. We want them to say, oh, we understand why you made that decision. May not be the decision we hoped for. No one's going to be, we're never going to have a station site where 100% of people are happy, but we don't want folks to be surprised, so we're very open. Next slide is pretty straightforward. A lot of these are the new projects that are continuing to go, and Mike will talk about those. Next slide, slide 15. The only contracting update is the PAN, the Project Authorization Notice, which we talked about at the last two meetings, actually, has been finally signed, which is great. We can move these contracts forward, these projects forward, which is just fantastic news. Moving forward to financial updates. As we talked about at the January 10th meeting, we updated the budget. This slide gives you the amended budget and the prorated budget, and then what we've spent actual year to date. A consistent theme as we go through here, and I'll lead with this, is we just amended a budget 3 weeks ago, and our spending in many places behind what we thought the budget would be. As we went through these numbers over the last couple of weeks, we found that many of our vendors have been slow in billing, and on us, we've been slow on beating vendors up to say, hey, bill us. A good example is the crash wall that you'll see a picture of later for our Alexandria fourth track project is complete. The wall is there. High five, it's done. We've not paid a nickel for that yet. We just don't have the invoice yet, which is great if we can make that last for a few years, but it's just not, that's a joke. That's not great. We need to get billed for that. So when we go through and say we're doing a ton of work, yet our expenditures are much lower than we expected, we just need to, and that's what we're focused on in the month of February, getting with our vendors and saying, hey, you need to send us these bills. There are a couple good reasons why bills haven't come in. For example, one of our major, our project management contract, we used to get lump sum bills and we would pay them. We've gone back to them and said, hey, we need you to break your level of effort up so we know what's Longbridge, what's fourth track, what is all these other initiatives, so we can tell project by project what we're spending. To their credit, they've committed to doing that. To all of our discredit, we've not received those bills and paid them. So that is our effort for the month of February, getting with our folks and saying, hey, get these bills in. What you will see is at the end of the year, we'll accrue all of these things, just like we did last year, and that's just sloppy. We need to get a better payment stream, and we're working on that in February.
CJ, one question. So is your push then, because, you know, in my world, the end of the fiscal year is the end of the calendar year, and you push like hell to get every bill paid. Is that what you're doing end of June? When is your push normally?
End of June.
Okay.
It would be end of June, yes. Yeah, yes, end of June, I'll just leave it at that. And then I'll make a new statement. Our vendors, however, have different pushes. So, for example, when their fiscal years end, all of a sudden we'll see them, and I imagine in March we'll get a lot of, oh, here's 7 bills for November through today that we'd like you to pay in the next couple of weeks. But our push is, and really our push should be every month, end of June.
Okay.
Going to the next page, the operations budget, this I hope you all are pleased with. It really breaks down the train operations in a lot of detail, and actually the next page we're even happier with because it shows it route by route. But the key factor here is if you look under the FY22, quickly. FY22 actual, our overall cost recovery for the State Board of Trains is 83%, 75% without the federal credit. So that's really a good number. That's a number that we're going to continue to track moving forward. You're hard pressed to find a public transportation entity that recovers anywhere near 100%. We have a couple routes that have in the past hit 100%, but that is a number that we are going to continue to track. As the ridership goes up, that number should get higher because the expenses in many cases to run a car train are fixed. And if you have a pack full compared to having it full, the revenue offsets that. So those are the numbers that we're really are going to be tracking closely. To the next slide, you see those same figures, although we don't have the cost recovery broken out train by train, and we will in the future. This breaks it out by the different routes, Route Newport News, Norfolk, et cetera. and gives a good breakdown of what we expected and what we're seeing. Overall, from an operations point of view, we feel good about where this budget is, and as ridership comes back, we'll continue to see better results here. Next slide shows our administrative budget. This is what we use to run Vpra. This is compared to the amended budget that was approved on the 10th. As you can see, we're well behind, but a lot of that is just as staffing comes in over the next few months, we'll catch up. And then the 23 budget that we'll talk about afterwards is right on path, because that we will have 34 people. Our plan is to have 34 people on board by the end of June, so next year's budget will be will not show as much of a catch-up as this year's has shown. Next page, capital project expenditures. These are the spendings that have come out, or the work that's been done on each of the capital projects that we are running. I'll once again point out Alexandria fourth track. We have a budget year to date. We expected to spend $2.2 million. We've currently spent about $100,000, yet that crash wall I've talked about, which is $1.7 million, is done. So that's a great picture of why we need to get billing in line, and we will do that. Our expected spending to date is $230 million. We've only spent $203 million. Again, most of that is due to timing of invoices that will be fixed. Next page tells a similar story. Unfortunately, these are the capital and operating grant expenditures. A lot of these are VRE projects where the work is not yet ongoing, but we are working with VRE to finalize agreements. I know VRE is anxious to put shovels in the ground and get the work done, so getting those agreements in place will move this work forward. And there are a couple more, if you look towards the bottom, Western Rail Initiative Grant, Roanoke Yard improvements. That's money that's in the budget, but is not expected to spend until later. And next slide, 23. Per the bylaws, we are required to come to the board and identify any budget adjustments. There are not any budget adjustments to report. We don't expect any. We're going to stay within the budget. We talk about that almost daily, sometimes twice a day. If Jennifer's in the room 3 times a day. Last couple slides are the ones that you've seen before. It just tracks the monthly revenues. Nothing really unexpected here. Next one's cash and investment balance. In November, we made the payment to CSX for the second of 3 payments for the transfer from Maryland, Virginia. And so that's why you see the dip in our cash and investment balance. And then the final slide I have is just cash investment earnings, same slide you've seen before. As the interest rates have gone down and our cash balance has gone down, those earnings have come down. We talked a couple meetings ago about the investment policy. The chair referenced it earlier today, and we'll be back at, I believe, the next meeting to talk about that in detail. So that concludes the executive director's report. I'm happy to answer any questions. And actually, I'm happy to answer any questions, but before, I also, any feedback you have on the report that, hey, there's really something I would have loved to have seen, but I didn't, feel free to call me afterwards or email me, because we want this to be useful to the board. We will continue, even though we're meeting quarterly, we'll continue to send this out every month, and we want it to give you all the information that you need to understand what's going on. So any feedback we obviously will receive.
All right. Well, thank you, DJ. Welcome, Mr. Nichols. We now have a quorum in the room, so we can take action on a couple things. I do want to, though, I neglected to finish in my report. I did want to give you all an update on the legislative session that's underway right now, and in particular, 2 bills that are directly relevant to VPRA. First, there was House Bill 456, which was being patroned by Elizabeth Bennett Parker, who was a former chair of VRE. This was related to the VPRA board membership. And as you may know, under the enabling legislation, the NVTC and PRTC are able to recommend board members to the governor, and the governor must consider them in making appointments to those seats. And it's a total of 6 seats. They were proposing to have a requirement that the governor accept or nominate people, appoint people only from the 6 people on the list from NVTC and PRTC. That was a bill that the administration opposed. It was laid on the table in a subcommittee of the Transportation Committee, so that will not be moving forward. There is still a bill from the Senate side, and this is the chief patron of this is Senator Todd Pillion from Bristol. It's Senate Bill 725, and in it, it is amending the enabling legislation to add a new board member on the VPRA board from planning districts 3 or 4, and those planning districts essentially extend from about the Christiansburg area south to Bristol. At this point, the administration does not have an official position on that bill right now. We may in the future. It has not yet come up. We expect it to come up in Senate Transportation, I believe, this week. So I'll keep you all updated on that too, but I did want to make you aware of those two pieces of legislation because they do directly affect VPRA. In addition to that, the budget is still moving forward. There are some bills that are potentially recommending revenue reductions that would impact the state's transportation trust fund, specifically a deferral of the increase in the state gas tax for 1 year, and then also a reduction of taxes on groceries, which then does filter into the transportation trust fund. I can't report to you today what those impacts would be for VPRA right now, or exactly how those are going to move forward, but those are really the other pieces of budget language that could affect VPRA's revenues and overall transportation revenues going forward. But we'll keep you all updated with that and with written reports too. So, okay, and with that, I'd like to move back to approval of the meeting minutes. There are a couple changes that were identified that I'd like to just call out to you all. For those of you that have the minutes in front of you, on page 3, under the motion for closed session, it reports that the board suspended the open session at 1:40 p.m., and that should state on January 10th, 2022, to move into closed session. Down below as well, when it says reconvene in open session, the date was corrected there to say January 10th, 2022. And then finally, on the last page, where there's a motion to authorize execution of Norfolk Southern Comprehensive Rail Agreement, we noted that Mr. Moorman had abstained, but the previous version of the minutes did not also note that Ms. Painter also abstained from the motion, from voting on that motion as well. So we've made sure to correct the minutes to reflect that. So with that, I'd like to see if anybody would like to make a motion for approval of the minutes.
I'm happy to make a motion to approve the minutes as amended.
Okay, thank you. Second?
Second.
All right, the second, Paul. Any other comments or questions? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And those of you on the phone?
Aye. Aye.
Thank you. Anyone opposed? Okay, that passes. Do we need to do a roll call vote? Okay, gotcha. And then the next item on the agenda is the approval of the slate of officers for next year. And I would like to, first of all, thank those people that have offered to step forward. Sharon Bulova has offered to serve for another year as vice chair of the board. Since Mr. Sadid will be stepping down from the board, Deborah Painter has also volunteered to fill in as the Finance Committee chair for the next year. She has been serving on the Finance Committee as well, but she's offered to serve as treasurer for next year. And then Jim Spoor has offered to continue as secretary for next year as well. So I'd like to take a motion first to approve that slate of officers, and then also I think the proper motion would then be to see if there's any proposed changes or anybody else that would like to volunteer for that. But is there a motion to approve the slate of officers?
I'll make a motion.
Okay, second?
Second.
Okay. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? All right, so all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Okay, and anyone opposed to that? Okay, great. Thank you to everybody who has volunteered to serve in those positions for the next year. So, okay, so with that, we're back on track for the original agenda. We have now the discussion of the FY23 budget. We presented this to you all in draft form last month, and now we would be referring, the action before you would be to refer this to the Commonwealth Transportation Board for their consideration. I'm going to turn this over to Steve Pittard, who is joining from the other room, to walk us through this item.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. Just want to start today by saying thanks to Mr. Sadid. He's been very, very helpful to me over the past year in his role on the Finance Committee, and also in working on the budget for this year, as well as the other members of the Finance Committee. And I also want to extend that thanks to everyone here at the Passenger Rail Authority. There's a lot of work that we put in the last couple of months, and hopefully we've come up with a better product as a result. So that being said, at our January 10th meeting, you'll recall, you did approve an amended budget for fiscal year 22. We also presented what we call a recommended budget for fiscal year 23. And we're here today to report back as far as feedback we received and any changes to the document from the January 10th document that we went through and y'all have reviewed. The only changes made were minor grammatical fixes that found in the last review of the document. There were not any changes to any budgeted amounts made. That being said, I just do want to run through once again, just verbally, the process. So each year we have to recommend a budget forward to the Commonwealth Transportation Board. They obviously provide a lot of funding to the Rail Authority, and then the Commonwealth Transportation Board has until May 30th, and essentially their approval in the code section relates to the capital expenditures of the Rail Authority. That being said, as a matter of practical matter, we basically ask them just to approve the whole recommended budget, which includes our capital grants in addition to those capital project expenditures. So with that being said, I will gladly answer any questions that may have come up that haven't been relayed either at the January 10th meeting or since then at this point in time.
Any questions for Steve about the budget? No?
Hey,
Okay,
Steve,
none in the room. Anyone on the phone? Oh.
This is Jim Spoor. I had a question. The chair mentioned that on the 13th of January, the CTB found a $2.6 billion ad, which trickles down to, if I got the numbers right, to us in terms of the 6-year CIP of about $215 million. So shouldn't some of those numbers be changed?
So that's a great question, Mr. Spoor. So when we knew about those revenue adjustments back early December, and so we did our work incorporating that revenue. And I guess if you recall, we had a little bit of back and forth with the scheduling of our dates, but those numbers are confidential until presented in the middle of December. And so straightforward answer to you is that data is already incorporated into the work we did. And it was the timing of release of that data forced us to have the meeting in early January versus our original planned timing.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from anyone on the phone? Okay. So with that, we have a resolution that was included in your packet for authorization to submit the recommended FY23 Vpra budget to the Commonwealth Transportation Board. So at this time, I'd like to ask for a motion to approve that. All right, thank you. And a second? Okay, thanks, Maria. So with that, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Okay. Anyone opposed? No, great. Thank you, and I want to thank Steve and his team for all the work, Shannon Perry as well, on putting the budget together. I know there was a lot that went into it and a lot of moving pieces, especially with some of these late-breaking revenue adjustments as well. And thank you to the members of the Finance Committee for your review and approval of that as well earlier. So.
And we also thank the board for their patience as we move these dates around because of it. It really has been difficult. So we thank you for your patience on that.
Yeah, and I should just note that this will probably be a recurring issue every 2 years when a new budget is released. Because of the timing of the governor's budget, which does usually come out in mid-December. And with this, with our current legislation requiring us to forward a budget to the CTB by February 1st, that does put us in a bit of a time crunch, unless there's going to be a legislative change in the future to change that date. But thank you for your patience as we had to move it around. In future years, we may not have that issue, but the good news is that it was because of an increase in revenues, so that's always a good. That was a good reason to have to move that around this year. So, okay, so with that, we now have a few informational items before going into a closed session, and Mike McLaughlin is going to walk us through an update of our Transforming Rail in Virginia milestones. So, Mike.
Hi, hello here from the Washington room. A few of us are just a few feet away from where the board's taking place. I'm with Steve, Michael Westman, and others. One of the reasons I'm mentioning the names while I'm presenting here on the milestones, many people have had a lot of work, performed a lot of work to actually make these milestones happen. We've had quite a few major milestones in the past few months that I'll get into, but while I have the honor of presenting today, folks in this room, other folks, engineering, planning folks, others have been working tirelessly to move a lot of these projects forward. So with that, next slide. Sorry.
Hey, Mike, one moment.
Yeah.
We have a question here in the room.
Well, another question I felt, when we had to vote last time on Norfolk Southern, had to move quickly because of me. It's an enormous accomplishment to get that deal. Jennifer, you have just transformed New City Rail in Virginia. Your team, DJ, everyone's just amazing. And I just take a moment to recognize how Virginia is an absolute leader because of work that you do and others. I'm just consistent with Mike's comment that, the Norfolk Southern deal is huge and it follows after the huge deal you just already had. So just kudos all.
Well, thank you very much. And it's funny because we have been so busy that we almost really haven't taken a moment to reflect upon, that deal alone and the time that went into it because we were kind of just jumping onto the next big thing. And but it does reflect a lot of work. I really also want to commend both Michael Westerman, who's in the other room right now, but our general counsel has just spent, along with our outside counsel, just spent countless hours working through that agreement throughout the holidays, Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve.
Literally those 4 days. That's not hyperbole.
Yeah, no, it's really not. And a tremendous amount of work. And so thank you, though. But that's, that was exciting, really exciting. So thanks. Okay. So, Mike, you want to go on?
Sure. So with that, next slide. And thanks, Patty, for those comments. This is from the budget document, but just want to point out that along with the numbers for the budget for each year, we also have a estimated level, as you can see in the left. What those numbers mean is how certain we are of the numbers. A lot of our projects as you know, are still in design phase, and not until you get to 30% design or final design do you know final numbers. So we do believe we carry sufficient contingency, and we also do budget for year of expenditure. But just do want to point out that different projects have different levels of estimate. Next slide. So as Board Member Dorsch mentioned, we have the Csx agreement that we finalized back at the end of March with the public ceremony. And I know there's a lot on this page. This shows the high number of projects that we have from Washington, D.C. down to Richmond. And just to remind people, they're slated for various phases. And this is actually part of the comprehensive rail agreement, the various projects, various qualifying projects, and the phases that'll be done. Phase 1 estimated to be done in 2026, and Phase 2 estimated to be done in 2030. And I'm going to delve into some of the major, not all the projects, but the major projects and some milestones we've hit. Beyond just signing the agreement, there were some milestones we've hit with individual projects. Next slide, please. So the first one, got to start with Longbridge. I'm going to have 2 slides on Longbridge because it's such a big project. I think we're all familiar with this, but it's good to have a quick overview on this page. It is the 2-track bottleneck that is a bottleneck for allowing more service to be delivered, for both VRE and Amtrak, and to connect the Northeast Corridor. And on both sides of the Potomac, there's 3 tracks on both sides. And the $2 billion project, which is 1.8 miles, it's not just the bridge over the Potomac, there's other bridges as well. We'll have associated projects with the L'Enfant project that Rich Dalton and others at VRE, we're working with them on, and also the 4-track project that I'll get into here in a few minutes as well. That'll create an 8-mile 2-track passenger corridor, 8-mile 4-track corridor, but 2 tracks dedicated to passenger trains. And there was some conversation earlier about how to best improve on-time performance, and this is where we're starting up in Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C., with a 2-track corridor from Alexandria to Union Station that will be complete. Hopefully, they'll be complete by 2030. I was going to say hopefully. DJ usually corrects me when I say hopefully, because it's my job to make sure they will be complete by 2030. Longbridge is a VPRA-led project. We have delineated the project responsibilities in the Comprehensive Rail Agreement, and it is the major project and one of the 2 projects that is responsibility of VPRA. We did enter into preliminary engineering back in March. That is expected to last through 2024 with final design and construction through 2030. And if people have questions, don't hesitate to stop me. I like the interaction back and forth. Next slide. So this picture is a little deeper dive on the bridges. We've mentioned before, it's not just the bridge over the Potomac. There's also the bridge over GW Parkway. There's also a bridge over Wilmata Tunnel and 395, Ohio Drive, Main Avenue, and Maryland Avenue. As part of 30% design, one of the milestones we're recently hitting is the project team is currently doing 15% design, and that will be going out to stakeholders next week. When I say stakeholders, Amtrak, VRE, VDOT, a whole bunch of other stakeholders, FRA. There's a whole list of folks that will be going out to as a formal 15% design package. The FRA did issue the environmental decision back in 2020, but FTA will need to adopt as part of the CIG process. When I say CIG process, I have presented in the past on the FTA's capital investment grant process, the 5309 process. We did enter that in November of 2021. We applied a few months earlier. It's normal to have a few months of back and forth to clarify items with FTA, and kudos to my planning staff and others who worked with us on that. But we were formally accepted in November 2021, so that's when the 2-year clock started ticking to get out of project development. We need to have the environmental done, which will be adopted well in advance of that, hopefully in the next few months to a year, and also complete 30% design to get out of project development. Also, and we've already given a few kudos to Michael Westerman, the CSX VPRA project authorization notice is being drafted and expected to be complete in the next month, and thanks to Michael and others who have been working on that. So unless there's any other questions on Longbridge, I'm happy to move on to the next project. Next slide. So moving downstream, going north to south, is the Alexandria Fork Track project, which I mentioned. As you can see from the map, this does tie in to the Longbridge project. That is $210 million. It'll construct 6 miles of fork track. There are 3 tracks in the area. Is a CSX-led project. Should also note that the track that is being constructed is on the side of the corridor that CSX will retain, and they will convey to us the track, one of their tracks when the fork track is done. It is currently at a 30% design, and we did issue a notice to proceed to CSX for final design in November. Construction estimated to be complete in 2026. Another milestone we just hit was the completion of a crash wall. I want to give kudos to engineering staff, Todd Hopkins and others who've been working on a crash wall. It is the early works package for the fork track project, and we were able to meet the US DOT grant obligation deadline. VDOT, and this is a sign of things to come, we'll be continuing to work with VDOT throughout the corridor. A lot of impacts we'll have on their structures and other facilities up down the corridor. They helped us with the contracting, and the crash wall is actually a crash wall at the underneath the road that leads to Washington National Airport. Many of you have probably been on the elevated structure in Crystal City that goes over the railroad tracks. Next slide. Unless there's any questions on fork track, this is also a project we're coordinating with VRE because there are 2 VRE, as you can see by the symbols, there are 2 VRE station projects, Alexandria and Crystal City, that we're working closely with Rich Dalton and his team on.
This is one also,
Next slide.
Mike, if I may.
Yeah.
Hold on, Mike.
Yeah, sorry, Mike. So this is one, as there are additional federal funds coming available by IJA and other grant opportunities, we would look to do more as part of this project. It would not slow down the project, but specifically around the Alexandria station, there's a lot of congestion and there are a couple bridges that need to be upgraded. There are good opportunities for state good repair and other improvement projects in this area that we are going to be paying close attention to. Because once the crews are out there, once you're putting commuters through slow orders and construction, we should get as much done as we can. So our plan is to look for every federal opportunity we can to get everything done there. And,
Madam Chair, or DJ or Mike, just what is a crash wall?
So a crash wall, that's a bridge, all right, and that wall is there. So if for some reason a train will go off the tracks, it protects the bridge's integrity, basically.
I gotcha. I was wondering if there was a road nearby and it was protecting the bridge structure from a car hitting us. You know what I mean? I wasn't.
No, and Michael, correct me if I have this wrong, but the track for the train is just to the left of that, I believe. It could be to the right, but I'm pretty sure it's to the left because we walked it a few weeks ago. And when the highway folks look at it, they say, if a train for some reason hits this,
Right.
that bridge is going to,
So it's protecting
that protects the bridge. Protects the
from the train going off.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Good. Thanks.
And DJ, could you tell us what might you be able to fund, what bridges in Alexandria if you get IIJA grants?
Sure. The King's Crossing.
Yeah.
The right one.
So
Is it
you're
big
having
one?
later on that one.
And then any other one we can find, but that one for sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Mike,
King and
King and Commonwealth. Commonwealth, yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
I kept on saying Queen, but I knew it wasn't Queen. And King and Commonwealth, that's right. Go ahead, Mike, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
those are the 2 bridges right by the Hilton in Old Town Alexandria near the King Street Metro. There's 2 roads that kind of V off. I'm sure many of us have been on those roads, the King and Commonwealth roads in that area. So, and yes, DJ, you were correct on the crash wall. That where the crash wall is furthest from the street, closer to the airport. So again, people have probably been on that Crystal City Drive. That crash wall is furthest from that drive, closer to the airport, if that makes sense. So moving further downstream, next major project is the Franconia Lorton 3rd track project. It's a $208 million project constructing 7 miles of track. CSX is also leading this project. Should also note there are 2 bridge replacement projects in the area. I briefed the board on this back in September. The Newington Road and Route 1. You can see the picture for Newington Road. Yes, that is 1 lane, not in each direction, 1 lane total going underneath the railroad tracks. So those costs are included in the budget as well. We are getting project partners and at Newington with VDOT and at Route 1 with VDOT and Fairfax County, putting in money in that project. And same with the VDOT on Newington. We're also, not only are we constructing another two-track bridge, there'll be a two-track bridge there now, another two-track bridge, we're going to be widening the berth so cars, buses, and other vehicles, bicycles, pedestrians, can safely traverse underneath the railroad track. So that is an addition to, so that would be within the footprint of the Franconia Lorton third track. But those have different funding streams and project partners, so those are slightly different in our budget. The project authorization notice with CSX.
Hey, Mike?
Yeah.
Mike?
Yes.
One moment, we have a question here.
Just one, it's not a question, I'm looking at the picture, and it's kind of amazing that this condition still exists, especially in this, busy area.
For Newington Road, and there is also I believe either WMATA or Fairfax County bus garage on the other side of this, and so this is a very substandard condition. So it's an opportunity for us to partner with Fairfax and VDOT as well to upgrade this crossing to.
It'll make a huge difference.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Director Bulova, it's a great comment. It's a good example of what we're doing here isn't just transforming rail. We're taking opportunities when it's presented to us to improve the local conditions as well. And at Route 1, not only are we widening that as well for various reasons. One reason is bus rapid transit, and also to allow better pedestrian and bicycle access under Route 1 as well. That is wider than Newington, but not as wide as it should be for such a major thoroughfare. And I had a meeting last week with VDOT and my lead engineer, and we've talked about the coordination we're going to need, not only these structures, but other structures all throughout the Commonwealth. So thank you for pausing and talking about the improvements we're making up and down the corridor. So unless there's any other questions or comments, next slide. So in the same areas, the Franconia Springfield bypass, a $241 million project. I think we've talked about this in the past, but what this will do is it'll carry especially the VRE trains, whose stations, if you think about in Stafford County, for instance, are on the east side of the corridor, where we own tracks and are adding third and fourth tracks down there, over to the west side. If you think about the Alexandria and Crystal City station we talked about earlier, that are on the west, the main part of the station are on the west side of the corridor. So this would decongest, especially VRE trains, with freight trains. It'll help with some of that on-time performance, and that DJ talked about earlier with all the CSX, Amtrak, and VRE trains. So it'll carry, the bypass will carry the the passenger trains over the freight corridor. This is a Vpra-led project. I should note that $23 million is coming from the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. DJ and I met virtually with their executive director yesterday, and Director Mitchell did a great job getting us money a couple years ago in the MVTA call for projects. So we are looking forward to using their money wisely. Project authorization notice for this is being negotiated with CSX and will take design to 30%. This project is a little further behind design-wise from the other projects because this is something that first came up during negotiations with CSX versus most of the other projects we're talking about were identified in DC to RVA, a planning document DRPT started quite a few years back.
Just for clarity.
Next slide, please.
I'm further behind the schedule that we agreed to starts later and ends later. It's not behind our schedule.
Yes, thank you. I know, DJ. You've corrected me before in that. I just meant behind design-wise. It started later in the process. It's not. Yes, we are moving forward, as you can see, with project authorization notice, and as DJ mentioned, we are I was hoping to give good news today, but my procurement officer would kill me because we have to give some notices out on the procurement for the design for the bypass. But yes, DJ, sorry, I think the second time today I got in your crosshairs.
Are you in the other room? I'm kidding.
Next slide, please. So moving on to, and again, didn't cover all the projects and the DC to Richmond corridor. If anyone has questions on the other ones, I just want to hit the major milestones on the major projects in that DC to Richmond corridor. I'll move on to Norfolk Southern projects. We did brief you on this recently, so most of this should you should recall from past months. There's multiple projects, but three major projects: Knoxville to Calverton, Roanoke Yard, and Salem New River Valley Track and passenger rail station improvements. Next slide. And also going north to south, Knoxville to Calverton double track. It's $50 million, and the comprehensive rail agreement that we mentioned earlier was signed earlier in January. It's February 1st now, so I can't say earlier this month. Lay 7 miles of double track allow for 22 miles of double track south of Manassas. It's just that gets us double track from Manassas to just 10 miles north of Culpeper. So it's a great improvement, and it'll help with fluidity of the passenger and freight trains. Norfolk Southern is leading this project, so this is a grant to Norfolk Southern. We did issue a letter of no prejudice back in June of 2021 for them to move forward with design so they can get started on the design. What that means is that they were, the letter of no prejudice means that they were beginning their design efforts at their own risk. And then once we sign a definitive agreement to go to financial close, their efforts will be eligible for reimbursement. So I think many people are familiar with letter of no prejudice, but just want to be clear, and that's what it was. Construction of this is estimated to be complete by 2026, but actually we've talked with Norfolk Southern about expediting that and getting that done much sooner. Next slide. The Roanoke Yard project. I'm not expecting everyone to be able to understand the diagram, but this goes to show that this is a graphic from our comprehensive rail agreement on Norfolk Southern's initial conceptual plans to improve the Roanoke Yard so that when trains come into Roanoke Station and they leave Roanoke Station going west, they will get through in a fluid manner. It is a $36.5 million project. We'll be working with them as they refine the plans for the Roanoke Yard. Also, they have the letter of no prejudice for this as well, and this is construction estimated to be complete in 2026, and we'll always look to expedite that if possible. For those who haven't been to Roanoke, it is a pretty good-sized yard that stretches quite a few miles from east to west of the Roanoke Station, and we want to make sure that this is one of the projects that has to be complete before passenger trains can begin their continuation on the Roanoke route to the New River Valley.
And Mike, this is Victor Cardwell, and I don't want to embarrass myself. My building is literally right on top of it, so I'm trying to, when you say the passenger station, come up the Amtrak portion that's right there, is that the yard you're referring to?
So
Yeah, there's 2 yards.
Okay, well, I'm going to get one right, because I know there's one down further. I just want to make sure
Yeah,
I know.
so it's improvements to that one that's farther west. But this track chart, I think, does, kind of hard to see from here, but I think it does include the station on the improvements he's talking about are further west of that.
Okay, I know they are.
Yeah.
Hey, Mike.
Yes.
Mike, it's Wick. I'm just sitting here looking at this and trying to remember something I should remember. The Roanoke station we built was a stub-in station. Are we keeping that configuration, or what will the station look like once we start running trains through Roanoke?
Yeah, good. As you recall, actually a platform has been built. An actual station house has not been built yet. And Jeremy Latimer, who's sitting to my right, feel free to chime in, Jeremy, if you want. As part of the plans we have so far to date with Norfolk Southern, there are no plans to change that platform configuration. It is the first high-level platform in Virginia. We're very proud of that. In fact, Jeremy was out there just a couple days before the event back in 2017, making sure everything was going smoothly. But yeah, we have not, looking at my general counsel, there have been no discussions in our negotiations to date about changing the configuration of that platform at Roanoke.
So will the trains have to, if they're going further west, head in and back out to keep going?
No. Initially, and you might be recalling some conversations that were had in the last couple of years, they'll be able to head in and then continue going straight west. At one point, we might have briefed you on this maybe a year or so ago. We might have been going back in and then going south. We are coming into the station and continuing that move westward. So we'll be able to come into the station and continue west, and that's why this project is so important, because initially, and hopefully I'm not getting in trouble with Norfolk Southern, there was some hesitancy to get through their yard. And we also had hesitancy too, because we don't want trains getting stuck in the yard. So what the project will do, as the diagram shows, is get improve the throughput of trains through the Roanoke Yard.
And I might add that, I think, Mr. Mormon, you might be recalling, originally we were building a stub end there, but it actually does connect on both sides. Now with a design we ended up building.
We
so
did
that
put
the
it,
train
we did put a switch in on the other end? Okay,
Yes, sir.
thank you.
Okay. Good question. Next slide. And as DJ talked about this before, there's a decent amount of work happening from Salem, where that's beginning of the 28 miles of the purchase of Virginia line to the New River Valley. And I'm just focusing here on the majority of the work that's going to be done in the New River Valley for a station location. As DJ mentioned earlier, we have a survey out. We've been over 2,500 responses so far to date. We're very happy with the response. We'll be having public meetings in late February and a second meeting in the 1st of March for the public, so we can receive feedback individually. What this project will do is it will construct track, signals, platform, and a station in the New River Valley. Again, the station locations, really 4 we're looking at here, on the east side, the Ellett area in Blacksburg, along the Virginia line at the end of our purchase, and then 2 locations near the New River Valley Mall. If anyone's been out to, I'm sure Mr. Cardwell's familiar, but for anyone else who's been out to New River Valley Mall, there is some north-south track that Norfolk Southern has that comes off their main line, and it's possible to connect the Virginia line to that north-south track and have the station be near the mall, which has received the most votes of support, without a doubt, to get to one of the 2 mall locations as far as the survey has gone so far. So this is a VPR-led project, so this isn't a grant to Norfolk Southern since we're constructing. This is something we'll be constructing. We are working with the New River Valley Passenger Rail Station Authority. They want to, as we build a station house, in the local, there's some responsibilities with regard to our rail plan and with regard to the state local's responsibility. They actually want to put their headquarters in a station, and we're supportive of that kind of use and other public use of any station that might be constructed. Also, it's very, very important for us to have pedestrian connections, and there's a great trail that DJ and I and many others have walked that goes along near the mall, that many people ride their bikes. It goes from Blacksburg to Christiansburg. So we're looking to coordinate that with the station construction.
And let me just add, Mike, if I may, that area, there's so much residential growth there within walking distance. It is, you can tell why it's an ideal choice from the public. We just need to be careful before we get too excited, because we don't have a sense for the true environmental needs. There's a lot of water there. We've got to wait till all the facts come in before we make any decision. But it definitely, you can see why that's the overwhelming opinion.
It would also require some private property acquisition as well, in addition to acquiring some additional right-of-way from Norfolk Southern that is not part of our existing agreement. So again, while that is our, clearly the publicly preferred alternative and has a lot of land use benefits from our perspective as well, there's still some challenges that we need to work through to make sure that is a feasible and cost-effective alternative too.
Right.
I see Sharon?
Is this an independent train, or is it part of Amtrak?
It will be an Amtrak train that it would be our Roanoke service that will eventually be extended to the New River Valley. So the 2 trains that we'll have serving Roanoke after this year will then, once these improvements are completed, would be extended to New River Valley. Yeah.
We do.
And a 3rd train as well, potentially between, we have a slot for a 3rd train between Roanoke and the New River Valley, and that is whether or not that would be an Amtrak train or some other services to be determined. So, okay, Jay?
Yeah, I really appreciate all the, discussion of the land use implications.
Mm-hmm.
This is not just revitalizing the upgrading something or expanding, is creating it, right? So for those of us in local government in the past, this is an anchor. This is a really important destination that will change the opportunity for the local government, for the business owners, for the retail, everything there. So what is the local government that is involved?
It is the town of Christiansburg, although the New River Valley Station Authority includes all of the surrounding counties in that area, so including the town of Blacksburg, Washington County, I believe, and Montgomery, in that area. So it's, but the town of Christiansburg is the
no
one.
way in, but the land is in Christiansburg. So
Yes.
that town council or city council is going to be actively involved in. And I'm just hoping that when we're doing the scoping and siting and planning, that they're actively brought in, because this may be their opportunity to change some zoning,
Sure.
you know, or provide some incentives. There are also public-private partnerships with maybe the landowners
Yep.
that have an investment there already. So I would encourage us early on to be having those conversations to see what opportunities exist on all sides.
Sure, and absolutely, and that will be a big part of the final decision. As you can understand, we're still in a NEPA process, and so we want to make sure that all of the alternatives are given the appropriate consideration. But all of those, along with the public comments that we get, will be taken into consideration.
So
Sure.
it's this, the legislation that we talked about earlier. So it's this planning district?
It's that planning district plus the planning district south of that to Bristol
Okay, that would like to have a seat
on the VPRB board.
on this board,
Yeah.
getting to,
Mhm.
engaging
Yeah.
with them.
Maria?
So this is maybe a good time. I know last year, I think it was, Jay had suggested maybe when COVID was a little more under control, we could actually have a board meeting that would be outside of Richmond, somewhere along the system. So just hearing all these capital projects sounds like, whether it's Roanoke or Christiansburg or, Northern Virginia, you know, there's a lot going on, and it would be great for us to have a chance to walk the track and see what's going on and all that. And then I am wondering, since I see this as your last slide, Mike, with the projects, especially the ones in Northern Virginia, I'm curious if there will be any impact to travel frequency, reliability, you know, will there be any impact to current riders in the future with these projects as they get underway, or will the new track and such be happening in parallel, and so it won't impact someone who's on the train?
Yeah, impacts from the construction.
Yeah. Just, I know road construction totally slows you down if you're on the road, so I'm wondering with adding new tracks if there's impact.
Yeah, I think it's fair to expect that there will be some impacts. Well, obviously, we'll be working with Norfolk Southern and CSX to minimize that as much as possible, and we're also looking at how to phase the construction in ways that will, along with VRE service and their projects too, that will minimize those operational impacts. I think it's fair to say with that amount of construction, there is the potential for.
That's what I was thinking, and I was wondering if, in thinking about the budgets and bringing on a new government relations person, if it would be wise to have a healthy budget for communication, and really having a campaign, so it's a positive spin why you may be delayed. I know we do that with some other transportation construction projects, and you can bring in the arts, and you can, you know, there's ways where people can be not getting really angry and agitated, but maybe excited about what the delay will bring, especially if there's impacts to other users of the transportation system too.
Pardon our dust campaign.
Yeah, exactly. Look
I think-
what's coming, yeah.
That's a great point. We've talked about working with the communities to make sure that the word is out there before the shovels are out there, but we haven't set aside money in the budget for that, and that's something we should look at, because you're right, being aggressive on the front end really helps you out.
Yeah.
If I can, Chair, a couple comments, if that's okay?
Sure.
I do want to note that in addition to the public meetings, I should have mentioned that we are having one-on-one meetings with private property owners in the New River Valley. That our director of planning, Kate Youngbluth, has set those up, and we're meeting with them starting in the next few days. So Town of Christiansburg, Montgomery County, private property owners, others in that area. So Director Facette, you're right on that we are having conversations. We've already had some preliminary conversations. We're having some conversations for the record as well in the next couple weeks. Also do want to mention that I forgot to mention that some of the screening criteria are transit impacts, and when we build out the budgets, that we're assuming that all these locations, transit, bicycle, pedestrian, will be brought to those locations as well. And one other point to the comment Director Zimmerman just mentioned, we do have a service planning committee with CSX and Amtrak and VRE. In fact, DJ and Director Dalton, myself, and Jeremy Latimer, who's running our rail planning services, we're at initial meeting, and the first of monthly meetings is beginning in coming days here soon. So to cover those issues, such as when construction happens, how do we best alleviate the pain to riders? So we'll be dealing with those issues, and we meet on a monthly basis with the service planning committee. So thank you for allowing me to follow up.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have one. Mike, thanks for going over that. My question sort of centers around the BIF funding. BIF, IHA, depends on who you talk to. What I haven't seen, and I'm sorry if I've missed this, but to the extent, so in MOC that I focus in with respect to FAA, takeoff landings, it helps in the formulaic portion of it, and there's discretionary piece as well. So we kind of have an idea of how the airports are going to get impacted. I guess what I haven't seen, and forgive me if I missed it, I'd love to be directed there, and if not, hopefully we can give some thought to it. At some point, I can foresee a question coming in from some of my local political personalities, particularly as the springtime frame gets here, and we can see more publicity on it. Like, how is that funding going? What implications will it have for local projects within our particular jurisdictions? And I think that would be something that would be helpful particularly for me in my jurisdiction. I'm sure for other directors as well.
And thanks for bringing that up. So the majority, actually really all of the rail funding is discretionary.
Right.
And so unlike transit and highways, where much of the funds are distributed through formulas,
right.
This is all money that we'll have to apply and compete for.
Yeah.
We are working internally right now and also with our secretary's office to put together a sort of strategy for going after grants. Fair to say we're going to put something together that's much more holistic and looking at our entire program of projects and how we can best bring in a state share, a federal share, if you would, into the project, and how we can target different grant programs to make up that state share, and then kind of build up what a set of applications would look like. I know that's something that both FRA and FTA are interested in hearing from us as well. They'd like us to come in and bring them more of a comprehensive overview of a federal funding strategy, as opposed to just a scattershot approach to coming up with a new grant application every time there's a new notice of funding. So that is something that we're working on right now. It's been very successful to the Commonwealth in the past. Our Atlantic Gateway project is actually a good example of that, where we came up with a huge multimodal program of projects that included both rail, transit, and highway components to fix the I-95 corridor. And we actually then applied for a single grant that could then, we could have some of that going to rail, some of that going to highways, some of it going to transit, and as a much bigger comprehensive package that had much bigger benefits. And so I think we'd like to approach this in much the same way, where we look at sort of a bigger transforming rail in Virginia approach to the federal funding strategy. But that will probably mean applying for multiple grant programs that may have different application cycles. But I know in my conversations with some folks at FRA and FTA, they're very interested in hearing. They're actually asking us to bring that to them because they want to have a way to sort of think through their own planning about the pipeline of projects they might have.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Sure. All right. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much, Mike.
Thank
So
you.
our next the next couple presentations are going to be by Jeremy Latimer. The first will be talking about St. Julian's Yard, which is a smaller property acquisition that's actually been in the works for a while through DRPT, and actually a somewhat older project called Arkandale to Powell Creek, which dates all the way back to our ARA funding. Just on a time check here, what I'd like to do is, depending on how long we go through the next two presentations, is potentially then break for lunch quickly, come back in for a closed session and complete our closed session items, and then if we need to come back for the safety presentation after that, we can do that. But that's sort of how I'm looking at the schedule right now for the next 40 minutes or so. So, okay. So, Jeremy?
All right, thank you. Good morning. So St. Julian's Yard, we're going to talk about what that is and the purchase that is currently underway. You can go to the next slide. St. Julian's Yard is the current facility where the two round-trip Norfolk trains are serviced down in Norfolk. So this was important to the state in partnering with Norfolk Southern and an entity known as Canoni Atlantic that owned the property and had licensed with Norfolk Southern to make this a service facility, and they in turn worked with Amtrak, who currently operates that facility where the trains overnight. So you can see there it's located near downtown and the Amtrak station down in Norfolk. You can go to the next slide. It's a very narrow strip here, but you'll see the dotted line in yellow is where there was existing track, and that is owned by Canoni Atlantic. And a little bit about Canoni Atlantic, because I'm going to be mentioning that name a lot. They are a private entity that owns the railroad assets. They have St. Julian's Yard here on the Norfolk side of the bay. They also have an area in Norfolk called Little Creek, which is operated by the Buckingham Branch Railroad. And then they have some 50 miles of rail in Accomack and Northampton County on the eastern shore. And they have been going through a lot of changes. They were operated by a railroad that no longer exists, and so they are divesting from some of their assets on the Norfolk side as well as in Northampton County. And so the yellow line you see there is the track that they owned on this facility. There are other improvements you'll see in some other pictures that Norfolk Southern built through a grant with the Department of Rail and Public Transportation to bring service, Amtrak service to Norfolk in 2012, which has also expanded to 2 round trips, which was started in March 2019. Go to the next slide. So Canoni Atlantic is the owner of the property. That includes the right-of-way and some of the tracks. And then there are other facilities there, including additional tracks, water boxes, crew facilities, things like that to service the train that actually are owned by Norfolk Southern through the grant that the state gave them back in 2010 to 2012. This facility currently in use is the Amtrak service facility, so it's very important for us to ensure that this stays available for that service because it does have the capacity for the growth in service that we have planned under the Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative. And so DRPT negotiated a purchase price on this property that was before the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority existed to secure its use as the Amtrak service facility. That offer was formalized in a letter November 4, 2019. And if you go to the next slide, I'll discuss that also there were some other programs through DRPT that had invested in this property and that adjusted the purchase price. But here we see this is so the Norfolk Southern tracks are the ones that are not in red there to the left, and the red is the turnout that comes towards the surface facility. So that's one of the parcels we'll be acquiring. You can go to the next slide. And as you continue east, I don't know if there's a delay, but I haven't gone to the next slide on my screen. There we go. So that's the bulk of the facility there that's in operation today. Go to the next slide, third parcel. And so this is the back of the facility where we have additional capacity for an additional train to overnight there. And some of the tracks as you get off towards the east actually don't exist, and there's a lot of trees there. So 3 parcels will be acquired. Next slide. So as I mentioned, DRPT had negotiated the purchase price in 2019. The $1,761,000 amount that will be purchased is the result of a $2 million purchase amount agreed upon, but due to past grants made by DRPT under the Rail Preservation Fund to help maintain a state of good repair on what was the short line railroad known as Bay Coast Railroad, because we have contingent interest in those assets, we're reducing the $2 million that would technically be owed back to the state, so $238,401. So that results in the final amount paid to Canoni for the St. Julian's Yard property at $1.76 million. Next slide. So still a number of things in flux here to complete this purchase. We do have a real estate purchase agreement executed by DRPT and Canoni Atlantic on January 5th. We have environmental work underway and being updated for the closing, survey, title inspection, title insurance in procurement phase. We have attorneys preparing the deeds and settlement papers and the transfer agreement, because this will be ultimately transferred with board approval from DRPT to Vpra. And then Canoni sending a letter to consummate the abandonment to the Surface Transportation Board. They may ask for an extension on that. There's a lot of moving pieces here, and so we are targeting a close in the second quarter of 2022. Next slide. Take any questions on the St. Julian's Yard.
Any questions? Comments? Okay, since this is a piece of property acquisition that will eventually be acquired by DRPT but transferred over to Vpra, we just wanted to make sure you all were aware of this. And this actually goes back a couple of years. It's somewhat of an opportunistic acquisition because of the abandonment of the property, but it's also an opportunity for us to have a permanent location for the storage of these Amtrak trains for our Norfolk service.
I just want to say, I think it's great. I think it's so forward-looking when you're growing a system like this. The last thing you want is to miss these opportunities and not have a place to do service and maintenance and everything else. So that's part of it.
Yep, thank you. All right. So with that, Jeremy, why don't we move on to the Arkandale project?
Okay. So the Arkandale third track and Quantico Station improvements. This is a legacy project. It actually predates a lot of things that DRPT and Vpra have grown. So as we go through this, I just wanted to put that out there. This is a legacy project, a lot of lessons learned. I'm going to go through all of it. Go to the next slide. So this is a project that's currently under construction. You can see the limits of the project. It goes through Quantico Station, or the Quantico Marine Base in the Northern Virginia area, so Arkandale to Powell's Creek being the limits of the design. This is a third track project, which it also includes the passenger station improvements at Quantico to improve the ability for Amtrak, VRE, and CSX trains to meet, pass, or overtake each other at a location midway along the heavily trafficked RF&P corridor. So 9.2 miles of actual third track, and 84% of that track construction is complete. The CSX is constructing the track and the signals, and VRE is a partner with DRPT. They're going to be, or Vpra, they're going to be constructing the Quantico Station improvements. The construction started in 2014, although the grant was awarded in 2010 under the AERA program, and completion is scheduled in 2023. I'm going to go through that schedule a bit and some of the complexities of this project. Go to the next slide. So the Arkandale project is a $125.3 million 9-mile track construction project with the Quantico Station improvements. The Arkandale third track portion of this, the CSX constructed part, was funded with the federal ARA funds. $74.8 million was awarded to Virginia in 2010. We supplemented that, the CSX part of the project, with $26.5 million, so the total budget for the CSX track construction is $101 million. The Quantico Station improvements, which is a partnership with Virginia Railway Express, we have $3.6 million in Commonwealth rail funds allocated and obligated, and then we have an additional $10.4 million in smart scale funds, so $23.9 million for the total Quantico Station. So state and federal partnership. Slide. One thing I wanted to do, and I heard some questions about the crash wall and stuff, and I want to make sure that everybody understands what when we say a third track project with stations, like this is a very complex project. And so the elements of construction do include tracks. And this picture, I think, demonstrates something important here. You'll see that we're actually using concrete ties compared to the other main lines there to the left where they have timber ties. And as we were going through this project in the design phase, for durability and longevity, they improved the distance between those track ties. So it resulted in more track ties needed, and those are concrete ties. So when we look at kind of the costs of what a modern rail project looks like, this is the difference between some of the timber ties we see there. So the third track is a significant part of it. Signals are also part of it. That signals are not a inexpensive piece of any rail project. They're very complex, very intelligent people designing these signal systems. Very important for safety. Of course, we also have positive train control now in the picture, and so everything needs to be up to standard code for safety regulations. I'll show the map of the project again, but one of the things I wanted to point out is we have a lot of water along this route. There's Quantico Creek, there's the Potomac River, Chesapeake Bay, and a lot of streams and things. So retaining walls are important. There's a lot of slopes in this area, so some of the retaining walls are holding back slopes, some of the retaining walls are holding the track bed. It's a very important piece of the project. I'll go through some of the challenges on that front. Quantico Station was part of the scope that evolved very early on in the award of the federal funds. So what was going to be two side platforms is now going to be an island platform with pedestrian overpasses over the tracks down to the platform on both sides of the tracks. Grade crossings are distributed throughout the project, so we have private and public crossings. One of the significant public crossings is there at Marine Corps Base Quantico, Potomac Avenue. We also have multiple bridges, we have to build causeways, and we have significant slopes that have to be dealt with. Access roads had to be preserved or rebuilt, and we had to work within the limits of the right-of-way that we had, which gets very tight, especially as you go through Marine Corps Base Quantico. And then we also have design for future build-out. So it's very complex as we're moving through this 9 miles. Next slide. Some of the project challenges, around the office, we say Arkandale really was the lessons learned on a lot of fronts. I mean, it is the project that will, from finding sunken Civil War battleships in Quantico Creek, to poor soils, just climate change, changing coastlines. So some of these challenges that were early on were in the project agreement phase. The ARA program, I think is important to recognize, put $8 billion into the public realm for passenger rail projects. And as mentioned earlier in this meeting by Director Mitchell, highway and transit get formula funding, rail does not. One of the significant impacts of not having regular formula funding coming to rail across the country is that there were not a lot of plans ready to go for $8 billion. And that's one of the things I think we're better prepared, especially in Virginia and North Carolina, but $66 billion coming out of the IIJA, really it creates a bit of a scramble across the country when you have these boom and bust periods of funding for rail. So the $8 billion, we learned a lot of lessons. The FRA was requiring service outcome agreements. That was something the railroads resisted very early on and set back some of the project agreements, and so it took years to get to agreement. When I mentioned about the planning challenges, a lot of states, including us on this project, did not have, we had about conceptual design for Arkandale. And so there were things that you find out as you advance design and you do more investigative work as part of the design process. So one thing we were finding out after we got under contract was that there were some poor soils in this area. We knew there was a lot of water, drainage was an issue, and these are things that you have to value engineer and deal with. We had a lot of steep slopes, not just those steep slopes, but who owns those slopes became a problem. We had changing coastlines. We did find at one point as we get close to the Potomac River there, Chesapeake Bay, that there was a lot of scour under the tracks from past hurricanes. And so when you look at the pressure that a new track puts on that embankment, do you have enough support? And so we had to go and secure that coastline to make sure that we had a safe railroad put into service. And that was complicated by the fact that the water and the land that we had to access was owned by NAVFAC, or the entity that owns property for Marine Corps Base Quantico, and takes years to get permits to enter. And then we also have utilities running along this, Verizon and CenturyLink and some plantation pipeline fuels. There's a lot of utilities in the area that run along it that are on the CSX right-of-way. And then there's also utilities that traverse it from one side of the tracks to the other. You can go to the next slide. Quantico Station, as I had mentioned, originally was planned when we went for the federal funds as 2 side platforms, and that quickly changed as we looked at service, in that we wanted, if we're going to build 3 tracks in this area, we want all 3 tracks to be accessible by a platform. So the island platform idea, where you put a platform in the middle of 2 tracks and then have a side platform on the westernmost tracks, was the way we decided to go. That requires safe passage for passengers up and over the tracks. That means you need to put in inter-track fences, especially in a area that is has a lot of pedestrians, because you go right through the Marine Corps Base Quantico, and the town is on one side of the tracks and the base on the other side of the tracks, so a lot of people crossing constantly. Those inter-track fences, the tight property lines with the town and the base, it was very tight to fit all this in. We had to get some permits. But we are going to be extending the east platform, building pedestrian bridges, installing inter-track fences, upgrading the Potomac Avenue grade crossing, and project completion is anticipated in December 2023. This is one of those projects that VRE has now begun in earnest, so they are digging the holes for the elevators. They are moving all the utilities. There is work. If you go through this area, you will see construction now. And so when Michael McLaughlin mentioned the performance committees, this is going to be one of those areas where we look at performance as we get into construction, and if we need to adjust any schedules or find other service solutions to make sure that trains move through efficiently and we don't have significant delays. Next slide. So I had mentioned that Arkandale was a project where we learned a lot of lessons. And, you know, to that extent, that even the ARA funding program was a lot of lessons learned across the country. Without such significant funding going into the industry, we didn't have a lot of the expertise ready to go. So a lot of states learned a lot of lessons, including Virginia. One of the things we've learned is that you want sufficient design before you put out a budget to the public and go after federal funds. We had conceptual design. We did have some estimates with more contingency, but the application we went after included an entire corridor between Richmond and DC at the time, and the award to Virginia in 2010 was for the $74.8 million on Arkandale. As comparison, I think North Carolina got about $500 million. And the appropriate contingency, we had about 10% contingency in that budget, which is not sufficient. As we designed for service, we found that the island platforms made more sense for network fluidity. So that introduced a design change very early in the process. And then the geotechnical issues, in that we had only advanced to conceptual level design, so we hadn't done a lot more of the geotechnical work to find out what challenges we had in front of us. That is something that you have to find places to put pore soils. They have to stay within certain project limits to not trigger certain environmental issues, and it was just something that was very challenging through the life of the project. The schedule, I mentioned the legal contractual phase. So at first, across the country, there was some resistance to the service outcomes that the FRA was trying to include in the grant agreements when they distribute federal funds. A good example of that is in our area, when you have a 9-mile project and asking for a service outcome on a 123-mile corridor, that was something that CSX was resisting. And so ultimately, the FRA did let go of that service outcome. And so our obligation under the FRA agreement is to have these improvements in service for 20 years once completed. Our award was made in 2010. CSX, FRA, state negotiations lasted through 2012 to 2014. And then the stakeholders that have affected the schedule include NAVFAC, or the naval facilities that own all the property for Quantico. We've had several years of delay on that front. Utility companies, we did have some legal confrontations with utility companies and ultimately came out with a successful solution for our project. However, it did set us back about a year and a half. And then we also had local permits that were needed. And, we just had some legwork to do with Prince William County when they were looking at a rail facility, which they're not used to giving occupancy permits for. And on the environmental front, the NEPA work, we did have some amendments that were necessary through the life of the project because of permits and because of extensions. We also had bald eagle nest season, which limits certain times of year that you can do work. We also had the northern long-eared bat, which limited times of year when we could do work. And then I mentioned before that we had erosion issues, including the scour under right-of-way along the Potomac River. So just a number of environmental issues. Go to the next slide.
Jeremy, we've got a question here.
What did you do
Yes.
about the long-eared?
What do we do about the long-eared bats?
We did no harm.
Hear that, Jeremy?
Yeah, so we had to avoid certain times of year during, I believe it was their mating season. Also, we had to check, I think, in trees and things that needed to be felled. So we had environmental consultants that were constantly out on the project and doing monitoring work.
Maria?
So yeah, this was really fascinating, Jeremy. Thank you. I have ridden this stretch many, many, many times. It's a beautiful stretch. I will say I often have thought, oh my God, I hope they're keeping an eye on these rails because you feel like you're about to fall into the river. And so I actually think this would be a really interesting little story to get in the Amtrak newsletter or the magazine, right? Of like literally, I often am like, it's beautiful. Oh my God, I hope I don't fall to my death. But if you think about just how much infrastructure we have to deal with climate impacts, and this is a very legitimate, it's not easy when we say, we want to make things climate resilient. It does cost more money. It is worth it. I also look at that, I'm like, boy, today you would probably never choose to put a line there in the first place, right along the coastline. But that was just a really fascinating story, and I think it would be, there's a way you could spin it that would be of interest, I think, to the project.
Once we finish the project,
Exactly.
be happy to do that.
Wow, interesting. Oh, my gosh.
Also, for clarity, it's beautiful. I hope I don't fall to my death. It's not the cover.
And this is the side of the corridor that we've acquired, which is one of the reasons we have learned a lot of lessons from this project, for better or worse. It goes all the way back to 2009 when the ARA funds were made available, a lot of parallels to the infrastructure funds available today, particularly some of the, having a sufficient level of design, sufficient contingency, really understanding the environmental challenges out there. I feel like with the projects we have underway, we've done that due diligence. A lot of that work was cleared environmentally as part of our DC to RDA environmental impact statement, so we have a much better feel in the corridor. Not to put Rich on the spot, but because VRE has a big role in this project too, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything from your observations about this?
For the benefit of the vice chair, I'll remind her, she's probably sitting over there. The predecessor to this project was the Cherry Hill Third Track project that goes back to the early 2000s. Right. So that's, and so VRE had taken that up to a, conceptual level, and then of course the state picked that up. So in terms of timing wise, where we sometimes say that these projects move at a glacial pace, that's a good example. And back to the station improvement project, yes, very excited to be out there, doing a lot of, the utility work, as Jeremy mentioned, and some of the other site clearance work. We currently have, work zones out there that we are currently managing through with no passenger interruption to this point. That's something that we are all collectively conscious of, and I will say that CSX2 is a good partner in ensuring that the trains don't get delayed in there. But nonetheless, we're very excited about it. If you want to see the actual progress of this project, you can get on VRE.org under our project page, look for Quantico, and we do have construction cameras out there that'll show you almost a daily update of this project and a time-lapse version as well. So a little plug for.
The time lapse is really cool.
Yeah.
That is really,
It's very, so thank you.
Patty?
Just one more question. The point that Jeremy made, well, many good points, but one of them was how at the funding at the federal level, all of a sudden you have $8 billion from ERA. Now all of a sudden we have $66 billion. It's really interesting to me that FTA and FRA has asked you to come in with a plan for discretionary grants. That doesn't happen every day. They don't ask every agency to do that. It sounds like that's a way to potentially take advantage of the federal funding, but how do we plan with these lumpy, ad hoc, potentially giant amounts of money coming at the federal level?
My personal observations is I think that having really well-developed project development plans, agreements in place, I mean, a ton of time, as Jeremy mentioned, went into just the legal work. And I will say we've learned a lot from that experience that we were able to incorporate into our CSX and Norfolk Southern negotiations, that we've nailed down a lot of those roles and responsibilities and engineering issues, construction budgets, things like that. But I think when you look, if our experience is any indication of what some other states may also be facing as everybody's in a rush to try to go after some new federal money, is to make sure that those plans are very well developed at the outset, that there's resources available to state DOTs or other, agencies that may be doing this, for them to develop those plans. It's not, there's such a rush to do, shovel-ready projects that I think a lot of sponsors then have to rush through getting their project to that point. But it's, I think it would be important for, personally, the feds to be able to provide some resources to make that happen, or state DOTs to do that too. So the good news is for us, I think, we've learned a lot from this experience. We've been able to incorporate in our agreements, shorten some of the timelines that we have here. And I think also we will be well positioned to go in with projects that are well defined already, and have a lot of the engineering work underway.
So is that, like, say, with like Norfolk Southern Agreement, there's obviously you're fiscally prudent. Here's what we can fund. Here's the money that we have. Where are the nice to have? How is that built out? Right, like funding the King Street Bridge, which 200 years old, however that is in Alexandria. I mean, how do you budget for something that you don't have the funds for?
Well, I'll add my observations and then DJ, that, as we've been going and developing the budget and refining things, and as you may recall from our January meeting, we did bring back some increases to the capital budget that reflected new information that we had, where it was usually the additional scope that had not been identified, as opposed to unit cost inflation. I personally think one of the things we're going to have to be very, very mindful of, as the whole industry does, is unit cost inflation. I think we're just seeing economy-wide increases in inflation that are going to affect our project budgets, and that's where we're going to have to manage very, very closely. Labor cost is another area that is absolutely going to be increasing. We're seeing it in bids today, and I think it's going to get worse as more money's out on the street. What that means is we've got to have extra discretion on the nice-to-haves that and we need to identify these things as nice-to-haves, that if we're starting to see inflation on our must-haves, that we are then going to have to be in a position to be able to pivot on some of these nice-to-haves if we start to see some escalation there. So that's why we'll have some good planning in place, program and project management plans for the use of contingency as well. Contingency certainly can be used to cover some cost inflation. That's what it's there for. But it also is to be available for scope creep or scope issues if that exists. So I think it's going to be a problem industry-wide, personally. That's really going to affect how we think about these nice-to-haves as well. I don't know, DJ, if you want to add anything to that.
I think you're spot on. I would add to that we're also looking at phasing projects. For example, on the CSX deal, we had phase 1 and 2, which are quote-unquote funded and going to be done by 2030. And then phase 3 and 4 are other projects that are not yet designed, but they are for all intents and purposes, nice to have. They're things that, hey, once Longbridge is done and phase 1 and 2 are done, these are the things we're going to look at. To the extent there's more money coming more rapidly, those are projects that we can pull forward. So places where we're putting in a third track now, in phase 3, there's a 2-mile fourth track. That is nice to have. We can make the argument that doing that fourth track in 2026, when crews are out there, when you've got the work gangs slowing down the railroad, makes more sense economically. We should take advantage and pull those projects forward. But it has to be done smartly. We can't just say, hey, this is on our wish list, there's money, let's do it, because then you get in a situation, and everybody's heard me say this, where you're writing 10 C papers instead of 5 A papers. So you can't afford to bite off more than you can chew. But I think you're exactly right. You've got to make sure you are nimble as funding opportunities come and go, because we can't rely on this money always being there.
Yeah.
So is that the plan? Like, it's something we're going to share with FRA and FTA? Listen, we're going to do this eventually. You know, it's not just a nice to have. It's, you can help us time value of money, et cetera, the cost efficiencies of pulling it up. It's just as important as everything else. We don't have the money for it now. With your help, we can do it now. I'm just wondering what's the strategy behind what we're going to offer.
I think it'll be both. I think it'll be looking at, I mean, personally, I don't think there's a lot of project elements in our current plan that we could say, oh, we can pull it forward, we can get Longbridge done, instead of 2030, it'll be 2027. Because frankly, I think that's also already an aggressive schedule.
Right.
And so, but I think when we think about, do we use federal funds to add new projects or add new stuff, or do we try to use the federal funds to advance what we have? That's where we're going to have to go through and make some and have some discussions with our partners about that too, about how much we use to try to, use or do complete our plans today, maybe move some state funding forward to some other things, versus how much we try to add to the scope of what we're doing, because we want to be careful about trying to do too much. But yeah.
Yeah, I think these are really important conversations and connections to be making and thinking about that strategy. I think DRPT is also a really important player as you think about the transit and the multimodal connections, because that shouldn't necessarily be part of the rail authority's budget, but if we're thinking about how do these projects leverage each other, and even thinking the issue you raised, Patty, I've heard here in GRTC even, of like, they don't really have their transit pipeline because they've been very limited by fiscal constraint and thinking about the regional plan. And so how do we think about, if you're getting a new station or these station improvements and we're projecting ridership increase, and how the transit agency could think of that as ridership increase that could access other FTA funds than necessarily the project scope specific for the rail authority? Because I just think our transit agencies locally could use some help with that. And if the rail authority is getting these meetings, wouldn't it be great to make sure DRPT and the local transit folks and others who are thinking about bike connections and other things are, so we're really being smart and leveraging it at a community level. Because things like the RAISE grants or other things, like they can be truly multimodal in what you're bringing in.
Yep, and I think,
don't have to bear all the costs.
and we're actually doing that now as well. On the DRPT and the transit side is looking at how we can partner with our agencies that are also thinking about pursuing federal funds to try to help them and tie it into leveraging our state funds that already go into that. On one thing, I just want to clarify back on the issue of unit cost inflation. It is an issue that I know VDOT is very, very concerned about as well. They are already doing a lot of scenario planning on the highway side. We are also doing some of that with our program management consultants now too, to look at what the potential impact could be of increases in unit cost and labor cost on our project budgets. I think it's something that the entire industry has got to be very, very mindful of, particularly with all this new money flowing in, that there's a real potential for cost inflation. We were very lucky for many years to see, I mean, I can think back 10, 15 years ago when capital costs, unit costs were inflating 4%, 5%, 6% a year. A lot of it was because of fuel cost inflation. It kind of leveled out for a while, down to like 3% or below, which so 3% was always kind of a safe assumption about what you thought your cost would escalate at. And if you can go back and look at the Engineering News Record Capital Cost Inflation Index, and it's pretty steady for the last 7 to 8 years. But I think now we're getting ready to go into another period of potential cost inflation, which will impact our project budget. So it's just something we're already thinking about it, doing some scenario planning on that. But it will then, like I said, factor into decisions about these nice-to-haves that we need to make sure that if we need to push some things out or maybe pull some things forward where there's opportunities to cut down on escalation costs, that we do that. So,
if I might.
So, sure, Jeremy.
Yeah, add a few things. So, we talked a little bit about how we've lessons learned. And so, yes, from the state side, the Vpra side, we're looking at robust risk management, like Director Mitchell was just discussing, and looking at year of expenditure and looking at proper contingencies. But I also wanted to mention, we have a group of states for passenger rail, that work together with the feds, both the FRA and staffers. And we talked about some of the lessons learned. And so out of the ARA program, the feds have also learned, like the ARA program puts strict deadlines on when that money expires. It expired September 2017, which is a date I'll never forget, because I remember it almost became less about is the project finished, and it became have we spent all the federal money. And so there was this, in addition to a scramble across the country to get that federal money, then it became a scramble to spend it. And a lot of those projects were not actually done, and states had to pick up the rest of it to see it through. And so they've learned that lesson, and they do not have those types of requirements coming down through this $66 billion. And actually in Milwaukee, when we last met in September to discuss these types of challenges with the $66 billion, a lot of the states came forward and said, our concerns are about the resources to implement. What does success look like for $66 billion in the rail industry in the United States? Is it going to be another graph where we have to be spending this much a day to get to the date where we've spent it all? Or is it going to be about the delivery of projects that have service impacts? So they have shifted towards the delivery of project and giving more flexibility on the delivery, and recognizing that planning is an issue. They've actually expanded the definition of some of these programs to incorporate more planning up front.
Yep. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. So it is just about 12 o'clock. What I would propose to do is that we take a 15-minute break, allow us to grab some lunch. Is 15 minutes okay? What I was going to propose is that we actually break now to go into closed session. Allow us to grab some lunch while we close the phone line to the public. And for those of you that are on the phone as well, you can take a break and reconvene. And is 15 minutes okay for everyone? Okay. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. We'll be eating our lunch while we are chatting, and go into closed session. And then we will, after that, open back up for closed session. We will have an action to take potentially related to our closed session. And then we have a safety presentation that I think we had discussed a couple months ago. I think we did include the materials. We included it in the materials. Depending on how long our closed session goes, I may suggest we defer the presentation on the safety presentation, or let you all just review the hard copy presentation and come back to us with questions. But let's see how our timeline shapes up.
Mm-hmm.
So, is that okay with everyone?
Good here.
All right. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and move into closed session, and we have a statement here that Vice Chair Bulova is going to read.
I move that the board convene in a closed session pursuant to Section 2.2-3711A1 of the Code of Virginia for the purpose of discussing prospective candidates and salaries with respect to specific Vpra employee positions and the performance of specific public Vpra officers, appointees, and employees, and Section 2.2-3711A6 of the Code of Virginia for the purpose of discussing a project involving the investment of public funds where bargaining is involved and where the financial interests of the Commonwealth would be adversely affected if the discussion were made public at this time. Additionally, I move that staff and attorneys attend the closed session because their presence is deemed necessary and will aid the board in its consideration of this matter. And we need a second to that motion and then a roll call vote.
Second, Hall.
Wait a second? Thank you.
Second, Hall.
Okay, with that, Joan, would you mind taking the roll call vote?
Absolutely. All those in favor of Ms. Belova?
Aye.
Ms. Butler Painter?
Aye.
Mr. Cardwell?
Aye.
Ms. Dorsch?
Aye.
Mr. Fiset?
Aye.
Mr. Hall?
Aye.
Mr. Mormon?
Aye.
Ms. Moses Ned? Mr. Nichols?
Aye.
Mr. Sadid? Mr. Spore?
Aye.
Ms. Zimmerman?
Aye.
The ayes have it.
Great, thank you. So with that, we'll take a quick break, and for those of you on the phone, we will be back at, let's say actually 12:18, so let's give ourselves 15 minutes. So, all right, thank you. I think we have everybody back and we have everybody here. So I have a certification that I'm going to read, and then we're going to move on to the two motions that we have in front of us. We are now going to take a roll call vote. I ask that each member indicate their agreement with the following statement. To the best of my knowledge, during the closed meeting, the only matters heard, discussed, or considered were those matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements under the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, and only those public business matters as were identified in the motion by which the closed meeting was convened. And I'm going to ask Joan to take a roll call vote to so that you can indicate that you agree with that language.
Ms. Belova?
I agree.
Ms. Butler Painter?
I agree.
Mr. Cardwell?
I agree.
Ms. Dorsch?
Aye.
Mr. Fiset?
I agree.
Mr. Hall?
Aye.
Mr. Mormon?
Aye.
Ms. Moses Ned?
Aye.
Mr. Nichols?
Aye.
Mr. Sadid? Mr. Spore?
Aye.
Ms. Zimmerman?
I agree.
The ayes have it.
All right, thank you. We have two resolutions in front of us. The first one is, and I'd like to ask a motion for this. It is authorization for compensation to the Director of Engineering and Construction and the Longbridge Project Manager. Is there a motion to approve that?
So moved.
Okay, second?
Second.
All right. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Great, thank you very much. We have one more resolution in front of us. It is authorization for the VPRA Executive Director to serve on the Board of Directors of Wytronics Group Incorporated. And again, this is a conditional approval that would also be dependent upon the receipt of a informal advice from the Virginia Conflict of Interest and Ethics Advisory Council. So, and would anyone like to move to approve that?
So moved, Madam Chairman.
All right, second?
Move it.
Second.
Okay. All right, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Say
Aye.
Aye.
Great. Anyone opposed? All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate your participation today. And I know our next meeting is not scheduled until May, I believe, but we will give you some updates as we go along on where we stand with some of the other matters that we've discussed. And appreciate all of you coming down here to DRPT today. So stay safe, everyone, and have safe travels home. And this meeting is now adjourned. Thanks.
Thank you.